What's better than elevators? Easy. Elevators filled with monsters. Previously on Little Giant Crafts.
But now I know that I don't like recreating specific things, which that's a good thing to know.
Well, didn't learn my lesson. Hello, friends, and welcome to Little Giant Crafts. One of the last big projects I worked on was my horror-themed miniatures game, Horrorstuff, and as I was working on that, I knew that I wanted to make some terrain that was appropriate for it. Now, obviously, you can do a lot of different things, modern sort of, city, neighborhood terrain, castles, ancient ruins. Horror movies can take place really anywhere. But I didn't want to start simple. I decided I wanted to do something big and iconic, of course. One of the movies that best encapsulates the whole monster mayhem vibe of the game is Cabin in the Woods. Now, quick spoiler warning, if you haven't seen it, it's an amazing monster movie, probably one of the best horror movies in recent years. So if you haven't seen it, and it might interest you, I highly recommend it. Now that you've been warned, the latter, half of the movie, we just get monster upon monster upon monster, just complete and utter chaos running wild. And I think the most iconic scene is the elevator lobby when the monsters all come out at once and, ravage the security guards. So I thought, what better thing to build than that elevator lobby? Let's see how it goes.
Let's get this party started.
Well, you know the scene. I am going to try and recreate that elevator lobby as best I can at this scale. So the first thing I did was rewatch the movie and take a lot of screenshots to use for reference images. And then I got started with, as best as I could tell, the floor plan. And then from the floor plan, I'd draw what the actual physical piece will look like. Instead of closing off the elevators, I decide they will stick out the back and you can see down into them, both for lighting and for being able to place monsters in there if you so choose. Overall, the basic shape is pretty simple. It's just getting the details right because there's a lot of lines and markings in very specific areas. So I just give it a quick color to get my head around it. And then I was debating whether to create the clean elevator lobby or the post-system purge, very bloody lobby. And what I decide on doing is I will paint the blood on a sheet of clear plastic and then I can add or remove it as I like. So once I have a general idea of the shape, I need the details. So I go back to my reference images and I start roughly using the size of these actors, figuring out the heights and lengths of everything. You can see I'm adding those in red. It's probably, not really that accurate, but for my purposes, it's close enough and it'll help me recreate it at a smaller size. So I go back to a top-down view and I put in the measurements. And then I also do a complete side-on view and add those measurements in. And then later on, I will convert those into inches or centimeters. I honestly forget. It's been a few months since I started this project. But the important thing is the ratios will all be the same, more or less. But once I have the details down, it's time to get building. I decide I'm going to make most of this project out of chipboard because it's a good mix between light and sturdy. So I just get out a fresh piece and I start marking off the dimensions of the floor. As always, I've got Captain America here and a few larger monster figures because if I'm using this for games, I want to make sure figures and larger monsters can actually fit in this space. Otherwise, I'm putting in a lot of work for no reason. There's not a lot to describe here because I'm really just copying the layouts I drew on the computer and just putting them onto cardboard and labeling everything so I know what the final shape is going to look like. Pretty early on, I realized that a single piece of chipboard will be too small to fit the entire elevator lobby at this scale, so I'm going to break the build up into two pieces. One half will have the little security office on the back wall and the two furthest elevator shafts, and then the other half of the build will have all of the other elevators. It'll be more obvious later. Once the floors and walls are all marked off, I cut out the holes for the elevator doors, and then I start working on the open elevator shafts. My initial idea was to make everything on the outside of the build completely black, like as if you're looking at a cross-section, but I decided that the elevator shafts themselves could have a little detail, make it a little more interesting. So I take a bunch of zip ties, which are great for detail because they have this ridged little texture, and I put 2 strips in each elevator shaft. In my mind, this kind of represents like, you know, whatever mechanism is pulling the elevators. And once those are glued in, I start adding strips of foam in between them to represent the sort of cutaway areas that will be black. And this will change later, but I mainly added this so that there would be a delineation between the elevator shafts and the cutaway, so it wasn't one flat surface. And then it's time to start gluing the walls to the floors. And I'm just going really slow and making sure to get them as straight and at a 90-degree angle as possible. Now, since there are so many details on the walls, I decided to use a mix of foam board and chipboard. There's sort of 3 levels of protrusion, the first level being the back wall, and then the next level out will be chipboard details, and the furthest out layer will be the foam board. For the foam board, I use a pen to gently carve into it. As I've mentioned in other videos, pens are really good for carving into foam because, unlike a knife or something sharper, they don't tear the foam when you draw into it. And then since you can't really do the same thing with chipboard, I instead cut individual pieces and glue them onto the wall, leaving gaps in between them. This is mostly easy work, just very tedious. And also being careful to make sure I'm following the schematics. For the little lights above the elevator doors, I just made up a simple shape in Tinkercad and 3D printed them. Then I get started on the back office. For the windows, I decide to cut some frames out of chipboard and then glue them onto clear plastic packaging, which is always great for windows at this size. And then I also just use a Sharpie to color in the side of the frames that is getting glued down because I won't be able to paint that later, and it's easier than trying to paint the other side of the plastic and, you know, maybe making a mess of it. I make the lower walls out of foam board. Now, while the windows are drying, I get to work on the back wall that connects the wall and the office. And I really wish I had stopped here and started painting because, as you'll see later, these walls next to the office are very hard to reach and they are a real headache to try and paint. So whenever you're building something, always try to plan ahead and identify any spots that will be difficult to paint later. Not only will you save yourself a lot of time, but you will also save yourself a lot of frustration. And then I start gluing the windows on top of the lower wall. And then I add more foam board to make the rest of the wall above the windows. And then I start working on the ceiling of the office as well as the sort of, I guess, concrete structure above it. And then for the roof of the office, I also cut 3 holes and cover it with clear plastic because the office has ceiling lights and I'm going to figure something else out later, but I know that I want the option of shining light down. And then once the office is assembled, I finish gluing the walls to the floors and the walls of the elevators. And then then I got a little sidetracked. I'm gonna be completely honest, I meant to finish this video around October, November to go along with my horror stuff video. But you know, life gets in the way, things happen, I put it off for a little bit. So here we are, 3 months later. Now, the first thing I did when coming back to this was paint the interiors of all the elevators because I'm going to be closing them in with another piece of chipboard in back. And here I did think ahead, and I figured, you know, getting inside painting on the elevators would be pretty difficult. So I did that first, but we're not quite at painting yet because I had a few ideas. So first off, I bulked up the walls dividing the elevator shafts, and I covered the office ceiling with wax paper. I knew I wanted the office lights to be opaque, and I went back and forth on a few different ideas, but ended up going with wax paper. Initially, I was apprehensive about using wax paper because I thought, you know, it's meant to sort of be a non-stick material, so will I be able to glue it down? The answer is yes. Wax paper, at least the kind I had, it glues just fine. I tested it first. Super glue, tacky glue, wood glue, they all stuck together pretty well. So that was a nice surprise. Now, when I bulked out the walls between the elevator shafts, I decided to do so with foam because I had an idea. In the movie, even though the facility is very bright and clean and high tech, you eventually see the ritual chamber. It's very old stone. You can tell it's, you know, much older creation. And then later on, we also see this sort of escape tunnel that's built, you know, between the walls, and it's these very big old bricks. So I decided to recreate that, and in my mind, the elevator shafts are also made with those big bricks. So I decided to carve bricks into these walls. And also, to get more of a rocky texture, I balled up some aluminum and pressed it into the foam. And now that all of those are done, it's time to paint for real. So I decided to base coat the whole thing in black. Now, I wanted to save time, so I was hoping I could do that YouTuber trick where I just, you know, wave my hand in front of the camera and snap, and nothing. Okay, it looks like I'm gonna have to actually paint this. All right, so I painted everything except the floor because the floor is white, and you'd waste a lot of white paint trying to paint over black. So I left the floor unpainted for now, but everything else is done. And then what I also did off camera was added a little bit to the elevators themselves. In the movie itself, the elevators have these glass walls, and I wanted to recreate that. So I initially painted the walls of the elevator a glossy black, but it still wasn't giving me the effect I wanted. So it occurred to me, more fake windows, to use plastic packaging material again. So I made a frame out of coffee stir sticks, painted them silver, and then glued those onto rectangles of clear packaging, and those became the walls of the elevators. And I'm very happy with them, except for the fact that the stir sticks fell off a few times and I had to reglue them, but it wasn't the end of the world. So now that the walls of the elevator are done, I can finally glue the back walls onto everything, except for the back of the office, because like I mentioned earlier, I want to put lights in there. So I decided that I would make a removable panel, and what better way to do that than with magnets? So I mark off some spots to make sure the magnet placement will line up with the metal placement, and I glue some magnets into the foam. And then to give the magnets something to stick to, I get some tin can lids. But it occurs to me I don't have any tools that can actually cut through tin cans. So we're going to come back to that later. Once all the backs are glued on, I get back to painting, just putting in the base colors. The walls are silver, the bricks are a dark brown, the office and the wall above it appear to be concrete, so I'm going with gray for that. Once the bricks are all painted, I go back in with a lighter tan khaki color and do a dry brushing. And then I paint the walls of the elevator shaft. I figured they would also be concrete, so I paint them gray. And for the tracks, or whatever they are that I made out of zip ties, I basically just give those a silver dry brushing. And then off camera, I used primarily just chipboard to make the office furniture. I built a little desk and a little computer monitor, 2 computer monitors, and then like the bank of security cameras. Probably the most fun part of this build was the bulletin boards that are on the back wall of the office. I cut a lot of little strips of paper and used Sharpies to color them different colors, so they would be like Post-it notes, and I drew some little graphs and some little handwritten things. And then my wife has a label maker, so I printed out some papers, and those were nice because they're on adhesive paper, so I didn't need glue. And that's also how I made the label for the System Purge sign, around the big red button. I really wanted that to look nice. So then I just cut the strips of paper into lots of small pieces. And then once I have all my little papers, I just start putting them on the bulletin board. And this is one of those things where you can get as messy and chaotic as you want, because obviously bulletin boards are messy and chaotic. Also, you can see in the background here, the back wall of the entire piece. I decided somewhat late to make all of that brick as well, because it occurred to me that if I do want to use this in a game, I would like as much modularity as possible. So I actually made a broken back office wall, so that way I would have more options for using it on the tabletop. But that was made the same way as all the other brick walls, so I didn't bother filming it. Then I glued all the little teeny tiny bits of furniture onto the desk, including a little computer with solitaire on it, because I figure, someone's probably asleep at the wheel. Now, I mentioned I couldn't cut through tin cans, and I said we'd come back to it, and we're back. Since I couldn't cut through tin cans, I got this really cool new tool, commonly referred to as tin snips. They're basically super heavy-duty metal scissors. They cut through the can like butter. It's amazing. Unfortunately, I was kind of worried, but the edges it cuts aren't very sharp. I mean, if you cut out a piece like a triangle, you can still get sharp corners. Be careful when working with metal. But the actual cut edges were pretty dull. So I just cut some small squares and glued them onto the wall to line up with the magnets, so that way it could be removable. And then for the wall of the office itself, I mentioned I made a second version with a hole in the wall, and I wanted to be able to switch these back and forth. So what I decided to try here is these strips of Velcro that I had lying around with adhesive backing. I just cut some strips and, again, making sure to put them in roughly the same place so everything lined up. I put 2 pieces on each of the walls, and I put 2 pieces on the larger back wall that they connect to. So then I decide I can't put it off anymore, and it's time to paint the floor. I had already marked off all the lines on the floor, so the first thing I did was paint those in a glossy black so that I could put masking tape over it and then paint white on top of that. So that's a pretty straightforward process. And then this also wasn't on film because I used my airbrush, but once all the black lines were covered up, I airbrushed the floor white. I used the airbrush because white paint in general has a very high pigment density, so it's a lot easier to see like bumps and paintbrush strokes. So I wanted to use the airbrush to get it as smooth as possible. The only unfortunate side effect of the masking is that it did peel up some of the silver paint, so that's just something to keep in mind and watch out for. But hey, it's not the end of the world. Spray weathering. You can see it's covered in paper because, I didn't want to get the white all over the place on everything I already painted. So now I just take off all the masking tape in a process that was pretty satisfying. Now I turn my attention to the blood splatters. As I mentioned in the beginning, I decided I wanted to put these on a piece of clear plastic so that I could have a clean elevator or a bloody elevator. Now the first thing I did, because the plastic is pretty glossy to begin with, I sprayed the whole thing with a matte finish because I didn't want the whole floor to look glossy. I only wanted you to be able to see the parts that were covered in blood. So I took some dark red paint and mixed it with gloss Mod Podge and a little bit of pink, and then I just slopped it on there. You can see the plastic has some white bits on it. That is from where it was glued to packaging. I'm going to cut those off later, so I just tried to keep the paint away from those edges. And then after I got those big globs on, I dipped a toothbrush into the paint, obviously a spare, don't use your normal toothbrush. And then I flicked paint off of the brush onto the plastic. This process was very satisfying and the results came out really good, even if my hand kind of looked like a murder victim by the end of it. And then I try the same thing again with a lighter red, but I don't like how it looks, so I don't use it. And then to finish it off, my good friend Danielle of Danielle Tries Weird Things let me borrow some of her technical paints. She had Citadel's Blood for the Blood God and the Army Painter's Glistening Blood. These are both really cool paints that they're basically just very glossy, thick red paint. Now, since these are more expensive than the cheap acrylics I was using, I didn't want to use a ton, so I sort of just added some little bits here and there. Also just to, give it some variation, because the blood in the movie is not all one color. You can tell it's sort of layer upon layer. Some blood is fresher, some is more congealed. So I just wanted to sort of build up the different layers, and these paints really helped sell that too. Also, they were more glossier, so they stuck out more, which just gave it some nice contrast. And then while that was drying, I went back to the main piece and just started cleaning up all the areas that were going to be black. So here you can see the finished blood sheet, I guess. I'm super happy with how it came out. So now that that's done, I'm cutting off the edges like I mentioned earlier, and I'm just trying to get in between blood drops. I don't want a spurt of blood that's like sharply cut in half, because that would look weird. But even if I missed a few spots, there's so much blood splatter, I doubt a few little mistakes are going to stand out like that. And the last thing I had to do was lighting, since I don't want to mess around with wiring and all that, at least not yet. I took a look at Dollar Tree and found some tiny flashlights that I thought would do the job perfectly. So I just built a little cardboard frame to stick inside there that would hold the flashlights up. And then I wrapped them in masking tape so that they would stay in place. It's hard to explain, but I think you can see what I mean. But the lights just sit snugly in place. So I think that's it. Time to see the final product.
Oh no. What did she do?
Ding! Ding! thrilled with this. I'm so happy how it came out. Even if, I decided halfway through to add a few things I hadn't initially planned on. A lot of times it's called like scope creep or feature creep, where you just keep adding more and more. But thankfully I didn't get too carried away this time. But I definitely look forward to making like more hallways and offices and do like a whole building setup in the future. But I'm really happy with this as a start, and hopefully we'll see more horror themed terrain in the future. But until then, I hope you enjoyed this one. If you want to check out what else we're doing, you can go to littlegiantmonsters.com. That's got all of our projects there, including links to our Patreon if you really like what we do and want to think about supporting us. Thank you so much to all our patrons that we already have. And until next time, be creative, be kind, and take care of yourself.
Give me a sample. A plosive.
Plosive. Big plosive.
Normal with a plosive.
Talking with big normal plosives. And one of the movies that I think most encapsulates... Did I say encapsulates weird? Encapsulate? One of the movies that best
It's not that big, fine. So
encapsulate.
Encapsulates.
I feel like a robot that's just like defragmenting. Bow, 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 bow.